All right, so we're going to start Unit 8, which is going to deal with evolution with Section 8.1, which is Foundations in Evolution. So we'll talk about kind of this discussion of where life comes from and what really kind of started the ball rolling in understanding life and how life changes and evolution. And then we'll kind of lead into Darwin, Charles Darwin, which did a lot of work with evolution. And of course, his famous book on the origins of species. We'll talk about that, but we'll talk about some individuals that influenced Darwin before we talk about Darwin. So, to understand life and where life comes from, we've talked all year long about what is life and characteristics of life, but there was this idea and this question really of spontaneous generation versus biogenesis. And it was a debate. It was an ongoing debate between scientists for many years. And so, long story short, spontaneous generation means that life just appears out of thin air. Okay, whether you want to say magically appears or it just shows up. I mean, that's what we mean by spontaneous generation. And then the short definition of biogenesis is life comes from other life. Now, where you're sitting right now, you probably think, oh, well, obviously biogenesis, we know life comes from life. Okay, but you have to put yourself in the time frame of some of the dates that you're getting ready to see. So the first in a lot of things in science and philosophy starts with an individual of Aristotle. And Aristotle taught the idea of spontaneous generation, says life just occurs, life just shows up. So the first kind of experiment to test this claim was done by Redeye in 1668, and he wanted to disprove Aristotle, wanted to disprove spontaneous generation. So how he did this is he put a piece of meat in the bottom of some type of container, and flies landed on the meat, and maggots grew. So in the second jar, he covered it with a lid, and the flies could not get to the meat, and the maggots did not grow. Okay, well, you would think that this would disprove spontaneous generation. Okay, well, two things here. Number one, at this point in time, maybe didn't fully understand that maggots come from flies. Number two, okay, forget about this last situation here. When you close the top of this container, you're kind of limiting airflow. Okay, and we do understand that life cannot happen without oxygen. Okay, breathing. So this was a major flaw. Okay? Not allowing airflow could be the reason life is not occurring. So Needham wanted to prove spontaneous generation, and so he put beef broth in a flask, boiled it, which boiling, of course, kills off anything that's living in that beef broth, waited, left it open, and organisms grew in a flask, and this all occurred around 1745. Spallanzani decided to do the same experiment and wanted to disprove Needham's experiment. Boiled the broth, same way, corked the flask, no organisms grew. Again, kept oxygen from getting to it, nothing grew. Still, not definitively showing that life comes from life or that life is caused by spontaneous generation because we still don't have airflow to the substance. So then it brings us to Pasteur. And Pasteur proved spontaneous generation did not happen and that biogenesis did. I should say boiled, not biled. Boiled the broth in a special flask that he designed to keep organisms from coming in. No organisms grew. In a second flask, he did the same thing, but there's another typo. He broke the top. Organisms grew. Basically, to show that biogenesis is what happens, not spontaneous generation. Life comes from other life. This happened in 1864. So if we look at the picture, you see the nozzle of Pasteur's specialized flask is open. Okay, air can flow through this, but in order for the particles in the air to get to the broth, it would have to work against gravity, which they're not going to do. When the top was broken off, gravity will push particles down, which will give us microbial growth. So he was able to allow airflow to reach a substance, the boil broth or the beef broth that was boiled. Air still reached it, but nothing grew. Okay. All right, so now we'll talk about Darwin's predecessors. First one would be James Hutton around 1785. And James Hutton used or looked at the different rock layers and really kind of proposed that the Earth is very old based off of geological structures that he observed, and understanding that these structures took millions and millions of years to form. Next is Malthus around 1798 and said that populations are going to grow until there is a limiting factor. Limiting factor is a very important vocab term when we talk about evolution and what really kind of drives changes in populations. So limiting factors is anything that's going to limit the growth of a population. This could be, and then another type of, it could be food, could be a disease, it could be space for habitat, it could be a natural predator, it could be competition, anything that's going to decrease or limit the amount of organisms that are produced and are growing. Next is Lamarck in around 1809. And he stated that organisms have an inner drive to adapt to their environment. And this inner drive is going to push organisms toward perfection to live in their environment. So this causes this idea of acquired traits. So acquired traits happen over time. And these are any types of traits that makes an organism more able to survive better in their environment, makes them more perfect. So this idea of use and disuse. So by using a part of the body, the animal could alter it over time. An animal could also lose part of their body by not using it over time. So Lyell in 1833 studied the changes in the earth and believed the earth to be very old. So Darwin thought that if the earth changed, then so must the organisms that lived on it. The earth is continually changing, then the organisms that inhabit the earth must continually change to be able to survive. If the organism change, it's going to take a long time, just like the changes in the earth. And that brings us to the last slide, which is Wallace. And this is around 1858. And Wallace and Darwin had a lot of the same ideas. They actually kind of worked together. So Wallace also kind of came up with the idea of natural selection. Wallace wrote an essay over natural selection, the idea of natural selection, and gave it to Darwin to read. And they shared these same ideas. So the work that Wallace did and gave to Darwin led Darwin to publish the book that he is best known for, which is On the Origin of Species. So that is the end of 8.1 video. There is a form that goes with this. Please complete that form. And if you have questions, let me know. Thank you.